So we can also request later that the Secretariat publish this to YouTube if you want to.
Ooh. Not really interested in that, but
we can be fair.
Sure. But it's recording now, so yeah, go ahead.
Thanks,
It's
Martin.
worth asking them to put it on YouTube, because otherwise it disappears eventually.
Alrighty. Okay.
So my question was, yeah. So I was just saying that we should, add a little sort of be very clear that this is normative and not rely on people to notice the all caps.
Right. And as part of this, we used to have some normative language in the security considerations, and now it just references up that upper section and removes its own normative language. Also, the section on talking about how the protocol statements have to be erased correctly, that is folded up into that earlier section because it's a requirement, not. I guess, Mir, are you?
So,
What do you think?
Did you? I looked briefly at it, but I didn't look up all the previous emails and discussion and so on. But did you mainly kind of reword the existing text, or did you align this with what Gori proposed a couple of days ago?
It is based on what Gori had. A lot of what Gori had proposed seemed to come from this section of the text, so it was already fairly aligned. So I just kind of like put the requirements in where they seem to come from and mainly tried to take Gori's wording.
So Gori here, I mean, there's a reason for this, because I originally came up with my list, and the process was I then checked the document, and where I found sentences that were nearly the same, I took the sentence from the document. So it's probably no surprise that they actually match.
Yeah, and just structurally, to go through the top level requirements in here. So there's the requirements section. It describes it. And so the first requirement is that you have to provide the common APIs for the common features. So you have to have general APIs. You have to include at least minset. That's the first chunk of requirement. Then the next chunk is that you have to allow access to specific protocol features, such that people who need to be able to set like a TCP specific option can do so if they have to. You have to have the protocol stacks you select have to be equivalent in what the application expects, so you don't break compatibility with them, and they have to have good security properties. And then lastly, you have to maintain interoperability. You can't have a one-sided, you have to be able to have a one-sided deployment. You can't require that everyone adopts the same TAPS system on both sides in order to talk with each other. And that's kind of just the high-level bullet points of these are the things that you really have to do in order to be called TAPS.
And at the risk of reopening an old wound, we don't take a position in that section on the use of framers.
I don't think with regards to interoperability, or
yeah, I'm not going to say this very clearly, but it seems like we might say, if you are providing a datagram service to carry stream-based applications, you must implement some framer. But I don't know if I believe that. I'm just sort of asking the question whether you addressed it at all in that section.
that's not covered, and I don't think that's something that you would want to be unless someone thinks otherwise. Because if you are trying to do essentially messages over a stream, an application using TAPS as a stream can, if it wants, just have a, just do out its own layout of data on a stream and ignore a framer, or it can use a framer as a convenience.
Yeah, I think we should not put any requirements on the set of protocols or the protocol stack combinations that should be implemented. And in this case, I see a framer also just as a very thin protocol layer.
I agree.
And I think on purpose, we don't put requirements on that.
All right, with that, I just...
Frame is just a way of implementing existing protocols. So.
Yeah.
an adaptation layer. I mean,
Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any reason to beat this any further.
So I think the action is on me to go through all the feedback we got, incorporate the various nits and fixes, and then hopefully, if we can get another round of reviews through the next week, and we can actually merge this in next weekish. Is everyone happy with that?
Delightful.
I just caught the end of it, but I think I'm thrilled.
Hi, Brian. How was dinner,
So
everyone?
Pretty good.
we do talk about the min set requirements, right? That like kind of these interfaces needs to be implemented.
Yes.
About saying like, because we have this whole tabs API, right? And like, you know, do we want to say more about like when you call yourself, like which part of the API you actually have to implement to call yourself tabs, or which part is like more optional, whatever, or is that sufficient?
My suggestion, it's got it here, would be that was an API interface discussion, because you have to get really into the detail of it to figure this out, rather than an architectural thing. I guess that only punts it to another document, though.
I agree. I'm just wondering if we can say something. I'm not sure. Probably not.
I believe that the min set goes into sufficient detail on the functionality that you have to expose, that if you did the min set, you'd kind of end up with the right set of API calls.
So yeah, I was more thinking in the line of like, we say as a very basic design principle that our interface is message based, for example, right? Can you leave out the message based part and just like have something that otherwise looks like tab and it still tabs? Is that something that we should make more clear?
I would argue that part of the part of the min set also directly follows that you have to become message based.
Does it?
Well, if you want to support UDP, you have to do those, but it doesn't require that you think of TCP as messages.
I mean, I'm pretty sure it says earlier in the document that the general design principles are around like asynchronous interactions and message based and so on. Like, and if you don't want that, you shouldn't actually look at tabs. But as we're talking about requirements, right? The question is what is required.
I think you need to be message based. Really, I mean, I can't see how you do these callbacks for multiple protocols without really being message based. I mean, in theory, you could do a subset, but I mean, is it really worth calling that out?
The whole thing is fundamentally message based, right?
Yeah.
I think we agree about that part. The question is, do we need to state it as a normative requirement?
Yeah, I mean, the simple thing would be to basically say, yes, we're just going to state this as a normative requirement, because it's kind of obvious from the rest of the document, because it's one of those things that if you manage to implement the rest of TAPS without having a message-based interface to it, and it's actually compliant, then congratulations, pointless, but well done, sir. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so like I'm not a gigantic fan of using 2119 language in places where you're essentially just sort of stating a fact, and it really feels to me like this is just stating a fact. It's message based. Boom, you know.
Yep. Kind of makes sense.
And I think to that point, a lot of the normative language that we are keeping that Gory helped identify are things that may not otherwise be obvious, like saying like, oh, you need to actually look at the things in the min set, because you may miss items. If you were just doing just doing your own overlay, you have to be careful about security because you may forget about that.
Right.
They're not just definitional tautologies.
Exactly. Well, I mean, we can have a long discussion about whether security is a definitional tautology or not. But I suspect we're going to have that.
Won't.
Not on this. Thank you. Thank you. That is, yes, correct. We're going to have that call with, or we're going to have that discussion with the security area directors at some point anyway. So
let me just do a quick management interrupt. So first, for those folks who haven't noticed, in the WebEx chat section, there's a link to the Etherpad. Please go there and put your name down, sign the blue sheet. For those of you who didn't already assume that, the IETF note well applies to this meeting. Have we talked this over enough that we can move on to other topics? Okay. I think this looks good.
Have we designated to describe?
So,
What's the question?
Have we designated to describe?
I was take light notes. I think if somebody wants to take more detailed notes, we can. I think the IETF virtual interim process has overcome my virtual meeting management techniques. And so, if would somebody like to describe?
I would suggest that we should just essentially note. I mean, if we go off on a tangent that is not essentially stuff that ends up in GitHub, we should scribe the stuff that is the tangent that isn't stuff that ends up in GitHub. Otherwise, I think we should just have a list of the issues and pull requests that we addressed as the minutes, right? Like anything that's an action item should end up in an issue anyway.
Can somebody produce that list programmatically at the end of the meeting?
It's probably easier just to put it in the Etherpad if I ever get the Etherpad to load.
Yeah, we just typed stuff into Etherpad to try and keep us right on what we were discussing that wasn't an issue. So we can do that now.
I'm at 564, although I will have to leave in about 40 minutes. I can't keep doing this.
Etherpad tools IETF port 9000 notes tabs interim 2020 April is not loading for me.
Yeah, we had the problem at the beginning of the meeting.
Take it from the WebEx.
Oh yeah, it's -01.
We're using the wrong URI.
So this is our second meeting this year, right?
Someone is typing minutes in two places in Etherpad now, both below and above the blue sheets.
Do them above.
Do them above.
Okay, I can move that. Not me. There you go. Now it's the same as Tommy's thing. We can remove it.
That actually appears to be loading. Yay! Cool.
Right.
We did one issue. Okay, cool. I'm happy.
Let's carry on.
The big one.
But thanks, Gory and Tommy, for taking this on.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up and making us think about it harder.
Okay, it's fine. I think we got to a good place, so I'm happy with where we got to.
Me too.
Better than the bad place.
All right, so Aaron, I think so. We have more issues we can go through. There's also the non-issue based item I wanted to bring up. What would you like to do?
I think I would propose that the doc issues are maybe will allow us to make a little more progress faster. And so why don't we work through the doc issues for the next till the bottom of the next hour, and then see where we are and whether we want to take on the topic that you described or continue on with the work in the issues. Is that?
Do we want to look at issues by document?
Yeah, let's do that. I would suggest, and maybe this is a little bit, self-serving with my architecture editor hat on, that we try and actually bang out architecture, because we were ostensibly done with that document about a month and a half ago.
So I think we have.
You can close. Well, we can close that one when we finish and merge the. Okay.
That's the last
Cool.
issue.
Well, we're done. No.
Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. We'll see you next
Cheers,
month.
everybody. So API probably has a couple more issues on it, huh?
Yeah. And do we have any open pull requests for API? I believe we do.
Let me have a look.
Yes, a bunch of.
We have 4 pull requests that are approved and 1 that's changes requested. I can look at these in the background and sort of like merge them. Let's talk issues now.
Great.
And then once we've talked issues for a little while, we can maybe have a look at 432 and see if there's anything that we can have to talk about to get it mergeable.
Okay. So I think in the past we've gone oldest to newest, so we've covered some of these previously.
Yep.
Maybe could we triage some of the new ones that came in?
Yeah, let's do that.
Great.
Sign up for free. How about I sign in?
Yeah, but I think there are like 2 older ones which we do need to discuss at some point. One is about framers still, and the other one is about. No, the other one is about multipass properties, I think.
Yeah. Let's
Framers and
try to get through
multipath.
all of-
That's like.
Let's try to get through all of the API issues at least.
Okay. So this one.
Do we want to do framers first, or which derail do we want to hit? Do we want to do the framers derail or the multipath derail?
I'm also fine with stuff with the smaller ones, but these are the 2 that actually benefit from like discussion, I think.
So I think with the multipass one, we should come to an end pretty close, hopefully. I think there's not.
The multipath active passive.
Yes, but I think the better discussion is now on the pull request.
Discussions on 437, and 437 is essentially approved.
Or 512, whatever it is, yeah.
Oh, 512 closes 437. Yeah.
Okay. Philip, do you want to summarize this?
So we did a lot of rewriting for the multipass stuff, so that we now change the multipass communication modes to have an additional passive mode for most use cases we had in the original document. So you can say, I want to have bandwidth aggregation, but only if the other one opens essentially the subflows for multipass TCP. The only discussion point that's left within this one is whether we want somehow to address the interface choice, which interfaces to use for multipass. And my recommendation or my wish would be to just add a note, a separate PR that says, please use the properties for interface or PVD selection to choose a set the multipass is choosing then from.
I think I would prefer that as well.
I think there are 2 more issues here. One is like I actually don't understand these passive modes. Because it's the other end, right? So it's like the thing that you decide locally is if you want to announce new paths or not, and if you want to use them. You cannot impact the other side. And the decision if you want to announce and use new paths is actually, I think that was what the other property is for. So I think this is mixing up the 2 properties we have right now in a way that's unnecessary.
So why don't we just have one passive? Essentially just allow the peer to do multipath.
Because
and then
to be honest, this was also my first thought. While writing this, I came up with the problem that it's actually a little bit more complicated. So one is the choice whether to let's talk in multipass TCP terms to make it a little bit easier. The first choice is which subflows to establish, and the second choice is which packet scheduler you use for the subflows. For the first choice, which subflows to establish, you can actually say, especially in the server case, I don't want to establish any subflows at all, but I let the client establish the subflows towards me, probably about a dozen interfaces. Then the second choice is once I have these subflows, which packet scheduler do I use to distribute the packets across the subflows? And for multipass TCP, there's no need that client and server choose the same packet scheduler. They can actually do completely different scheduling of the packets. So therefore, the passive one is just deciding on, I don't want to open any subflows at all, but the other one might. And the address exposure property is actually whether I want to send this additional header in the multipass TCP announcing my other IP addresses, which I don't need to do anyway, because I can still establish additional subflows without announcing my IP address before.
Yeah, so actually, so I think the two decisions you just said are completely independent, right? One is like when and how to establish subflows, and the other one is how to use them if they are there. And it doesn't matter if you open the subflow or the other one. So if you are in aggregate mode, use all the flows, all the paths you have together, no matter who established them. So I don't think you need a passive aggregate, because like when you get a new flow, you just use it. There might be actually three things here, and we need another option for it. One is like how to use the different paths. What's the scheduler you want to use? Who is the one opening the different paths? And like when and if you want to announce a new IP address. So these are three different things which should have three different properties and should not be like interconnected in a weird way.
I have no problem splitting these now two properties in three. No problems with doing that.
But does the current PR have two properties? It looks like they're kind of entangled.
It has one properties, which are still a little, they are all still a little bit tangled. No matter if you make them three. But at the moment we have two properties, and Milja is now proposing to make three out of them. So whether
I think the original property was essentially about how are packets scheduled on the subpaths, right? That's the handover interactive aggregate, right?
Well, it was also if you used it or not, right? Because you also had it was also bundled with not using multipath.
Yes.
Which is an option that is now part of active passive or not at all. Yes.
So by not using, you mean not even announcing it in the handshake?
Right.
Not allowing
Refusing
multipath.
to
I mean, you should have either disabled, active, or passive should be your choice in terms of.
Yeah, but isn't that like it might be a separate property, or it might be rather connected to if you announce IP addresses or not.
Right.
The IP address announcement is a separate.
We have four properties.
It's already a separate. Yeah, right.
So should we have four properties then?
Wait, why four?
This is what I understood from you, Mirja.
Yeah, just saying multipass on or off. Do I want to send the option or not in the handshake in case of TCP, for example?
So if I am a listener and I do not allow multipath, then I won't negotiate in the handshake. If I do allow multipath, I guess I have the ability to accept it, but then I could not do it. Okay, yeah. Yeah. I mean, right. If I am a server, oftentimes it's not even going to necessarily work to try to open up paths to the client.
Today's internet, the chance is pretty low that this succeeds, but you can try.
Yeah, you can. And if you're doing something like peer-to-peer multipath, I mean, knock yourself out. Try it.
So, I'll say the way that it is right now reminds me a whole lot of ProcNet IPv4 TCP ECN and Linux, which we'll leave that as an exercise to the reader to determine whether that's a good idea or not. I think it's fine. I do know that this echoes a really long conversation we had in the quick interim about adding the sort of multipath stuff to quick, and the outcome of that was essentially, hey, this is still kind of research, so we don't want to do it. And I would say with respect to TAPS, I think, hey, this is kind of research, so we should put an arbitrary stopping point on it and ship it, because we're never going to actually, assuming that the research in this space keeps going for the next 5 years or so, whatever we publish right now is going to look a little silly. And if like sort of generic multipath on top of Quick is a thing that takes off, then we should just rev the interface to be what Quick does, honestly.
So I want to rehash the Quick discussion, but I don't think there's as much research as people think. The research is really about the scheduler, not too much about the interface. An interface is easier to change.
Fair enough.
And there is an interface for MPTCP that has been implemented, so we should be able to reflect the same functionality in our interface.
We should. Yep. We should be able to reflect exactly that.
And I think the thing that is not probably kind of widely deployed is this different scheduling strategies, which are like this aggregate, handshake, handover, or whatever, interactive, or however you want to call it. But I think that's actually very valuable, and that's something Apple has deployed. So if you can like line it with what has Apple in there already, that would be really nice and a benefit.
Okay. Actually, so this is good. So I think that what we have in the notes right now, or let's take what we have and turn it into a more orthogonal set of things, which seems reasonable. I think the scheduling strategy stuff is a separate question, and that seems like a protocol-specific property for now. Which
is it though?
No, it's not the protocol specific.
It's very not protocol specific. The scheduler is really one-sided.
That this is the most general in a way, because the fact that you can announce IP addresses is a bit more about.
And the fact that you can announce IP addresses is a knob that we need. Because
I think it's very valuable to have this knob if we can align it with what's deployed within Apple, because then we have experience about what actually works.
I would say, like, even from a theoretical basis, I don't see not having the IP address announcement knob be an explicit knob making it past a privacy review, which I'm guessing is why you have it.
To be honest, when writing it, I found out that there's still an entangle, because if you say you're doing active and you're not doing IP address exposure, you still have the same privacy implications, and I explicitly stated that in the PR.
Yeah, in some sense, I think active, passive, and disabled maybe would be enough for the three first ones. Can they not be combined? Do we need the fine-grained details?
I think I will update the PR next round, split between active, passive, disabled as one knob, the strategy as a second knob, and the address exposure as a third knob. I think these three knobs should be fine. So just putting the first
into
two
active, passive, disabled.
Yeah. Which is actually what's there right now, right? Or am I not?
No,
not quite.
We have at the moment we have one, two, and 4 combined.
No, sorry, I was just looking at the wrong tab. Yep.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Good.
Let's see that updated PR then.
Yeah, actually, I have another point. Sorry. I think the other point here was that anything that is regarding announcing interfaces should really be on an interface basis, which is also not covered by the current proposal, I think. Or did we resolve that already?
I have a proposal how to resolve that, and this would be to explicitly state that you do this with the interface properties we already have, and say, if you say you want to establish multipass, then everything that's preferred will be chosen for multipass, and we only fall back to something not preferred. And if you say prohibit, then it doesn't take part in multipass. If you say avoid, it's only used as last resort for fallback after everything else fails. I'm not sure whether to put it in the multipass or in the interface stuff up there, but let's see.
Okay, that's at least a solution.
Document 2. Some of those details could go into the implementation document, like saying, oh, and when you're, as kind of general advice, if you are implementing protocols that exchange IP addresses or, do hole punching or whatever, like you should follow the preferences about interface usage on the properties.
Yeah. Just putting a small note in the API and the details in the interface, in the implementation sounds fine.
Because in general, I guess your comment, Mirja, also applies to opening paths, right? I mean, exposing the address or opening the path is kind of similar there. It's possible that you might want to open paths over certain interfaces, but not over others. So
it gets you a little problem because you may change this for multipath protocols. You may change your preferences there later on, which we do not support at the moment.
I somehow have had the feeling that this is kind of a property of the local endpoint. And you really, for every connection you open, you might make a different decision.
The problem is it's not a property of the endpoint because you can still change it later on. I think this is the big problem.
Why? What is the use case for changing it later on?
So your interface configuration changed and you want to migrate your connection.
So it depends how you're specifying your interface preferences. If you're doing it purely by like a named interface, then yeah, maybe you have this problem. But if you express your preferences based on kind of like the interface types, that shouldn't dramatically change. Like
I agree with that.
Yeah, like if I want to, I prefer Wi-Fi networks, and yeah, my Wi-Fi changes from EN0 to EN1, but like that shouldn't change my overall stance. And hopefully the application should not be required to be monitoring those level of details.
Yeah, that's the right way to go.
Okay.
So, but there might be a case for an application where you actually want to know which are the paths that are currently in use.
Yeah.
Something we should also want to expose.
Do we not let you look at your paths?
Not sure.
Didn't the access and inspection of the path stuff is undefined.
Right, but it's not. I mean, I think people
permitted
practice.
Right.
We do it, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff that's undefined in terms of what you can query, and I don't think it would help a great deal if we add the long list of all the possible things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Management interface may need to query everything, so a proper implementation probably has that.
Yep.
Agreed. Okay, so we've beaten this one to death. Did you want to talk about the other fun one?
Actually, we do say in the interface draft that for connections that are established, additional properties of the path in use as a thing that you can query. But it's like part of a long list, and we don't define an interface for it. But we do say that you should be able to query the path and what properties it has. It's in section 10, managing connections.
There you go.
Yeah.
Look at us.
Great. Done next.
Okay. Go on.
Wait, are we noting that? Okay. Cool. Yep. I'm good.
Yeah.
Timers.
We're looping now, right? We are.
I assigned myself to this. Why?
Thank you.
420. Oh no, Mirja and I talked about this. And I had 427.
I think this is an easy one, but there should be another issue on more general framing.
No, the next one. Yeah, this is an easy one, and I can actually just go ahead.
This is the one we're talking about.
Like this is I had an editor open to actually make this change, and then I got interrupted by a child. So
it happens.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, so I mean, I did review And this is the only place in the implementation draft where we actually find another interface. So I'm still very uncertain about the split here. There are a couple of things in the implementation draft which probably should still stay in the implementation draft, but I think it's also having the split as it is right now. If you read the API draft, it's still really hard to understand what framers are, and having some of this interface description in the API draft makes it also, I think, much easier to understand how this is supposed to work. For example, the whole fact that it's essential that like you should call the framer before you start any other transmission is only in the implementation draft at the moment. I think that's actually an important part.
What do you mean by calling it before?
Before you actually, after the transmission or the connection is initiated and before you start transmitting any data. So you can do something like start TLS with it. Like how you would do start TLS with it, I think we could like add actually more example text in the implementation draft. But the fact that you have this interaction should probably be noted in the API draft, or in general how the interaction works between the framer and the connection. Actually, I'm still confused about it.
Well, so the application, what is defined for the application in the API draft is how it adds the framer to the connection. That is all that the application itself should need to do. The fact that that framer gets invoked while the connection is starting up to participate in kind of like a layer of handshakes is for the implementation of taps to do, not the application. Like the application doesn't need to go and after it's added the framer to its pre-connection, poke it again during initiate.
So my thinking here was that you could also, as an application, implement your own framer easily, right? If you know as an application, you need to prefix the length of the message. And that's the framer that is not provided by the taps implementation. I thought it should be an easy way for you to like implement this little logic into it and kind of provide your own framer.
Yes, it is. Yeah, that is the goal, right? So the goal is that as an application, you can either write your own framer, or you can, pick one up that someone else wrote.
But isn't how to implement a framer and API implementation detail? Inside the taps interface rather than it's at a different level to the API we're describing here.
I don't know what I'm saying is this is an interface that has to be known by the application if you want to implement your own framer, right? So it is an API to the application, and it does help a lot if you look at this interface to understand what framers are and how they're supposed to work.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't have to implement a framer. You mean?
No, but you don't have to implement you don't have to use all the taps interfaces to get a connection, right?
It's kind of a different level to the rest, and the framers are kind of internal to the way the tap system is implemented.
So when I looked at the first framer interface, it looked a little bit alien to me in the API because the framer interface was a lot of buffer management, which I think we have nowhere else in the API document. So roughly describing what a framer is in the API document is fine with me, but having the full-blown interface that does the buffer management, I think is too implementation specific to put it in through the API. So perhaps we could drill it down to some rough description of the framer that should be consistent about all implementations, and then stop it at the API. But the level of detail we have in the implementation shouldn't go into the API.
No, so I agree that especially the part about buffer management should be in the implementation draft, but that's really just a very small part of the text there. This interaction between like when does the connection call the framer and how does the framer call back the connection? How do you keep the data flow running? That's the part that I'm missing in the API document.
To be honest, that can still be implementation specific.
Yeah, I thought that was implementation dependent. And at the API level, you just say use this framer.
if you want to implement your own framer, you need some kind of interface to interact with the connection at the time of receiving and sending data.
I kind of view that as an internal interface. I think that the implementation draft should say, here's a sketch for what a framer interface looks like, but the API should just say, specify.
I understand why you call this an internal interface. If you provide an internal framer, yes, you use the same interface, but if you want to implement your own framer in your application, that's an interface the application needs to know, like all the other interfaces.
Right, but every single implementation
level, right? So there is, in a sense, two levels here, but maybe we can point to this fact in the API draft and say, if you as an application want to implement a framer to use within the TAP system, please see the implementation draft.
API to implement a message framer can vary depending on implementation. Guidance on implementing message framers can be found in the implementation document.
You already see this. It's already there.
Very good.
Yes, but I think like if you only read the API document, you don't understand what framers are. So I think you need to provide more information about the data flow here. This could be a diagram or whatever. But then my other point is also that I find it weird that like this is the only place in the implementation document where we actually define an interface, right? And why
we define a like 3/4 of an example interface. It's not a full interface. And the problem with this is that like an efficient implementation of a message framer is going to be tied very deeply to the implementation decisions that were made at implementation time, as well as probably to some of the features of the platform that the implementation is running on top of, right? If you're doing something in a kernel, it's going to look completely different than if you're doing something with Python async IO to, pick on Macs, which is going to look completely different if you're doing it inside a stub library that gives you an RPC-like interface to these things, right? These are going to be completely different it's not an internal interface, but it is an interface that is that it makes no sense to specify in a standard, because both accidentally and on purpose, we're basically then saying these technologies you will not be able to use to implement a TAP system, and we don't want to do that. I agree that framers are underspecified in the interface draft. This, as I understood it, has been sort of like emerging working group consensus on purpose, simply because any overspecification or anything less than underspecification of the framer interface in the API document might actually then end up constraining how you can implement these things in the implementation draft.
There actually would be a different path, Brian, which would be possible is specifying some high-level framer interface that all applications can implement. But say if you want an efficient implementation, you should rather use the implementation-specific one. But I'm not sure whether it's worth the effort doing that.
If in either of the documents, we basically say, here's an interface that we know to be low performance. Please don't implement it. People are not going to read that part. They're going to implement it, and then they're going to be pissed off that TAPS is slow.
But I agree that everything that is related to buffer management, if you copy data over or if you just provide a pointer or whatever, right? This is all very implementation specific, but this is like currently it's 3 sentences in there, right? It's more about in which point of the data processing do you actually call the framer, and how does the framer call the connection back? And I think that's actually I think what Philip just said. That's this high level interface that is implementation, not implementation specific, which is already there, and we should move it back into the API document.
What if we described it without providing like API calls? And you mentioned like have a diagram. And the architecture has a diagram at a very high level. And it feels like we're missing, like it just says, they're here. What if we had the more detailed diagram about framers and how they fit logically in a new section in the interface document? We don't provide API calls because we're not pretending like you're actually implementing it here, but show like, this is what they are, and they plug in at this step of the process.
I agreed to the most that I think the problem is that even in the diagram we have in the architecture, I'm not sure whether the framers are placed right, because you could have a framer that is just called by some kind of hint and then called something to be loaded into the network card, doing the deframing and pushing the already deframed messages up. So this would be a very high performance implementation that's not very far-fetched, but it's putting the framers somewhere completely different than we have in the architecture diagram.
And even just that makes even so. I agree with you completely, Miria, that we should be able to come up with some sort of abstract interface here that's at least where the data flow goes. But even that example shows that it's hard enough to do that I'm still inclined to punt like we're punting. I mean, we're absolutely punting, right? Like we're absolutely looking at this and saying, no, we don't know enough to actually define this interface, so you're on your own. But I mean, that's a pretty trivial interface or a pretty trivial example that Philip just brought up that is really not far-fetched.
But I'm not sure if that example completely works because, as long as you're in the tabs layer, right, you didn't even touch the transport protocol implementation. At some point, you have to give the data to the protocol, and if TCP is not implemented on your network card, then you shouldn't talk to your network card directly. Yes, and I think that's the assumption we have right here.
Essentially, explain that the framer is in between the transport protocol and the application.
And like how not a framer. Okay.
Like wherever you put.
True.
Well,
we're making a choice here. Like it is not true yet. We are deciding whether it is the consensus of this group that it is true.
I would have thought if, for example, you were implementing HTTP, then the thing which framed the HTTP things, which is clearly part of the transport, would be the framer.
TAPS framer.
That's when HTTP is being used as a transport protocol, so it's still between the transport and the application.
But the way you implement the transport is by implementing a framer as part of the TAP system.
I think what we do with the framer is we add another layer, protocol layer on top of whatever is underneath. And it's the highest layer. It's always the one that interacts with the application.
Layer might actually be a pseudo layer because it has 0 bits in the protocol. Because the bits in the protocol that would do the framing are actually application logic that's been pushed down into the transport system.
I thought it was also possible to stack framers, right?
Yes.
But only on top, right? I don't think you can have whatever HTTP, then a framer in between, and then you have TCP.
Well, you can, but then you'd have to implement
TLS kind of. I don't know.
Well, this is actually how we got here, right? Is like we started trying to figure out how to do start TLS with framers, and we figured out the only way to do it was to underspecify them to the point that we have.
So that would actually be interesting. I think we should definitely have a full kind of example toy implementation how to do start TLS with framers in the implementation draft.
Yeah. Okay, good.
And then it would be nice actually to have another example. And then if we have those 2 examples, you can figure out if there are common things that we have to move back into the API draft, maybe.
Can I make a terrible suggestion that I'm going to try and get everybody to disagree with me so that we can move the conversation forward? I'd like to leave framers as specified as they are in the interface draft. And if we can come up with anything that is more specified than that, then it should be in draft IETF's TAPS framers, because there's a whole sort of there's a lot more discussion to have here, and I don't want the publication of this draft to gate on that.
So, but I think, maybe we can at least say something a little bit more about the data flow, because as it's currently described in the API, it's kind of useless, and that would be a shame.
So I'm watching Tommy type, and I disagree with him. Okay. It's not or leave as is, it's and leave as is.
So still specify
so we want to do the stuff in the first option anyway, I think.
Okay. So we write this
because that's fine. And if you're doing sort of the not so weird, we're gonna partially offload taps into a thing, it's still between the rest of the protocol stack and the application. It's just that it's folded.
Yeah.
But anytime you're doing offloads like that, you're folding stuff anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So my guess after having read the implementation draft kind of recently is that just doing those 2 points is actually moving a lot of the text from the implementation draft back into the APA draft, but I leave it to somebody else to try, give it a try.
We can do it without actually bringing over the things that look like code calls. If we just say conceptually this is what they're doing and not talk at all about like how you implement one.
I think it's still moving a lot of the text just over and then taking out the implementation calls, the interface calls maybe. Yeah. Give it a try and we talk next time.
Okay.
We're just going to be standing agenda item on framers indefinitely.
Someday.
So is somebody able to give some example implementations for 2 different kind of framers? One would be start TLS and the other one would probably be just like a simple prefix thing.
I mean, I've written framers in Swift. I can copy those into our pseudocode. Or if Max wants to do it.
No, we have one framer, not start TLS. It's one of multicast protocols, which is a bit more advanced than some basic frame. We could maybe just do 2 examples or something. Maybe one in Swift and one in.
We have all of WebSocket implemented as a framer.
We need a taxonomy of framers.
That's the document that I'm saying we should write after this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And by we, I mean not me.
Cool.
No, because this is a fascinating rabbit hole to spend 3 more years in. And it would actually be a productive, fascinating rabbit hole to spend 3 more years in, but I want to publish the API before then.
Yeah, me too.
I agree on both accounts.
I mean, just having framers which let you use a TCP connection as a way of sending messages is probably all we need for the base draft.
Okay.
We did framers. Awesome. Cool. Meeting's over.
So before the meeting is over, the attendance here and the blue sheet doesn't match. So please fill in the blue sheet on the Etherpad. And it seems like people are getting hungry. They want sandwich framer, beer framer. So let's move on.
Okay. Can we start with some of the newer ones that we've never talked about before?
Yeah.
We have a couple of discussed ones in here. Or you just opened one, it looks like?
That's tiny.
Okay. Great. Who wants to do this?
I'm probably going to open another one with words. Okay, so Tommy, I'm probably going to read a little bit more into it and probably find another few sentences which are broken. I could probably continue to do that, and then we could
make a PR for it.
Yeah, I can't do PRs. They're hard. And Lars Eggert tells me that I do them very badly when I try to do them.
Gory, think of this as an opportunity for improvement. As we are all stuck inside, this is your pandemic hobby, is learning GitHub.
Yeah, but I have some great people at work who can help me do this. It's just not here anymore in the same room. Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll find more nits and then we can discuss whether I'll do the PR or not.
All right.
It's up to you. There's a goal.
No, you have to do it, Gory.
Yeah.
Wow.
You should talk to Lars about what happens when I do. Anyway, let's carry on.
No, we're not going to let you, Gory, we're not going to let you merge the PR.
Oh.
It's easy to hit the wrong button to merge it automatically, probably.
I recall doing that like 20 minutes before a paper deadline. Anyway.
So, but Gory, there's an online editor. If you edit something there, it will become a PR.
I have literally done on I feel bad for admitting it in public, but I do use the GitHub editor now, and it's pretty nice.
Yeah, that's what I did with Lars. He hates it, but for some reason I don't understand. Anyway, this is as good as a discussion about whether we have beer or not. I did another issue.
Okay.
So that one I assigned to myself because it looked like a to-do to me. I looked at the text that Miria pointed at, and this is very old text that I think I wrote very long ago. Okay. It says things like the capacity profile text is TBD because it's not defined yet. So I mean,
I think that's
obviously just needs fixing.
Okay, so is this ready for text?
Yeah, you're ready for text when I get to it. I wanted to do it.
So next one, enum for querying properties. This one about.
Yeah, that was Kyle asking for the querying to be something more reasonable than well, you know, the requirements levels that we're having for selection properties, because basically you just want to know if they have been used or not. And well, you see he gave an example of required, avoid, ignore, for instance. So I ended up just suggesting a boolean, which is true or false for having been used or not used.
And this is in PR 557 is the...
Yes, that's what it is.
And my finger is hovering over the merge pull request button on this one right now.
So it's returning whether or not it has been applied?
Yeah. Which is different from whether or not the request has been honored, right? Because if I say avoid, then I would still get false if it hasn't been applied. Well, I think that's a less contrived feedback rather than saying has it been honored, and then if you say ask for something negative and then it has been honored and it's true, it's weird.
I see. But
using true is easier.
If I had prohibited, or then it should never return true.
Right, it should always be false.
If I require,
say avoid, it's still it's still there, then you get a true.
Love it.
Yeah, you figure it out. You get true or false. But if you get true, then it means it has been used, even though you asked for avoid.
Feature has been used, not.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I'm saying. It's different from the request being.
Yeah.
I clarified that in the text.
Okay. Are we happy with merging 557 and closing 528 now?
I'm happy with that.
Cool. Going once, twice. Merged. You got to click twice, right? Confirm merge.
Okay. What is this all about? That's from Kyle versus.
Can I say something on the list about how I originally thought this was a problem and then later on reconsidered? I think we could probably close this one out.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm still thinking about the previous one.
I think the set is about the sent one, by the way. You mix it up. If Miria wants to go back to the previous one, then I'm jumping ahead already. So sorry.
This one?
The selection properties.
Yes. That one that.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if Boolean is always the right thing, because sometimes you might have a selection property where you actually, if you query the congestion control that is used, you can get something like none, or you can get a specific congestion control value or whatever.
So the way that this pattern works is you would essentially say, are you using this congestion controller?
Mirja, what you mean, that would be a connection property, right? Not a selection property.
Yeah, actually.
Not a selection property, right?
So this only applies to things that were prefer, avoid, require, or whatever.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just selection properties.
Yeah, but then isn't that as soon as it gets selected, isn't it a connection property, and that's what you want to know?
Yeah, so there's two queries, right? You can query if it has been selected, and if you find, yeah, it has been selected, then you can query for what type of congestion control it is you're getting. By querying a connection property that is the congestion control one.
We don't have that yet. We also don't have.
Right, it's not listed anywhere, but I mean, well, it's a property. So I think the expectation that all connection properties are readable.
But as long as it is a selection property, it's not selected or not. Then it turns into a connection property. Then you can actually say if it's selected or not.
But this query is for whether or not that mutation from selection to connection property occurred. Right? Not the actual value of it, but just the.
Yeah, but that's still something you would query a connection property for, not the selection property.
The queries of the connection properties are unspecified.
Yeah, that's right. You may want to have a statement somewhere saying that you could query selection properties on active connections once they have been established.
That's a separate bug, though.
Yeah.
I thought that's something that you just don't do, because as soon as you have a connection, it becomes a connection property.
No.
Not really how it's defined, right? Because we are separating. We have connection properties and we have selection properties. So
not in all
it would make sense, but it's not how it's structured at the moment.
If you want, we exercised this in the beginning, and I had a lot of fighting for that. And Mirja, if you want to have it that fine-grained, you would have gone to my overcomplicated proposal I had in Montreal for 3 years ago. So I guess if we wanted to keep it simple, we can't really solve this problem with mutating stuff.
Also, to make people aware, in section 10 of the API draft, we already say that you can query on a connection that is established, closing, or closed. You can query the selection properties of the actual protocols that were selected and instantiated. So we might want to adjust that to whatever we decided here. Right? But that part already says that you can query what got selected or what didn't get selected.
No, that matches the new text perfectly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah,
cool, says the guy who wrote the PR.
There's no coincidence here. No, not at all. It's completely. Yeah.
I guess we had stuff Michael wrote was somehow already in one revision of the document. So he reintroduced that.
And that's why it matches the old text that we didn't remove.
Yes.
It gets better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
What's the resolution now? Because it, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I would leave it as it is. I think it's easy and simple, right? I think you're just making it more complicated because, I mean, yes, most things become connection properties. Like, for instance, if you do have congestion control, then you can have the connection property that you query, which tells you what congestion control it is. In some cases, it doesn't. I mean, you have some things that are more binary, which are just enabled or not enabled. So structurally, you know, we just have these selection properties, and it makes sense to have them queryable.
So what we now have is we have a selection property, and you can, on a connection, you can query whether this feature was enabled or not. And if you want something more detailed, like which congestion controller was chosen, then you have to add another connection property that explicitly exposes which congestion controller you got. Which you also can.
These are two different properties.
Yes.
We already have a lot of examples that are also like one selection property, whether you want it or not, and then a connection property, like what is the actual value of the thing you wanted.
Yeah, so, but it's still the case that we have properties, right? We have certain properties that only make sense to set during protocol selection or path selection or whatever, because they impact this and they do not impact any kind of configuration later on. And there are other properties which do impact the configuration as soon as the selection is done. But these are still all properties, and like my understanding was that the notion of what a selection property is not like really relevant anymore as soon as you have created a connection, because then everything what you need to know is a connection property. And like I probably should look at the list of selection properties, but I'm just wondering if all the selection properties are only yes and no, or if they're actually selection properties that do have a value or whatever.
There are some
yes and no because they have this type.
There are some
Yeah.
which have an additional value attached, but the selection properties are usually defined in a way that a selection property is a property that only makes sense setting before the protocol and path selection is done. And afterwards, it's just variable whether this was used or not.
But then I think the right way to put this is that when you put the selection property in, you also put it on like true with a preference to it. And then as soon as you turn it into a connection, it turns into a connection property, which is either true or false, and you don't need the preference anymore.
And then you can change it because all connection properties are changeable, which makes it more confusing. That's the structural thing here. I mean, you could have a table of all the connection properties that are attached to the selection properties that they were before. It's just making it.
So I think the original text that was in was just saying that the type preference is some kind of Franken type that just mutates after protocol selection to Boolean. So it's a preference before selection, and it mutates into Boolean, saying the actual result afterwards. I think that's pretty clear, or pretty clean.
Yeah, I mean, some of them wouldn't be attached to any connection property that you want to be able to change, or that has a number to it. For instance, these binary things like notification of excessive retransmits or ICMP soft error messages, or direction of communication. You know, these things are just. Well, that's an enumeration. Am I looking at the right list here? I'm not sure I'm looking at the right list. Well, anyway, some of them, they're even hard to find. I agree about the restructure. Selection properties.
I mean, I agree that you need to somehow query those, and you need to get somehow it is selected or not selected, so which is always a binary probably. We just have to maybe make another pass and document and see if everything fits together still.
So, I mean, and I think there's another action from this discussion, which is to create an issue to talk about, we need to say anything more about the querying of the connection properties.
And when we're opening that issue, please mention section 10. So whoever does that should first read the beginning of section 10 so we don't duplicate efforts.
Read the beginning of section 10 and then figure out what more we need.
Exactly.
But isn't that, sorry, I'm browsing the document. I don't know it as much by heart as Teresa does. So we have this call connection get transport properties, which should give you a list of.
Yes.
So we have that already.
Yes, we have that already. We don't have specified to the bloody detail what this has, what this exact results of what this is in detail. So we have the interface, but it's only very roughly specified. The selection part is much more defined to the point compared to the querying of connection properties.
Yeah, it just says with that call you can query it. I mean, that's it.
But it also says querying, for example, the congestion control property also yields a value false if it's not selected. So there is already text in there. Or did somebody just press the merge button because it's already in here?
I just merged it.
Well, that's why maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, I merged it and it rebuilt the document.
Because I was just surprised.
Yeah, this PR was merged before we started the discussion. We're like, hey, is it good to merge? And I'm like, and everyone's like, yeah. So I clicked merge, and then Miria's like, wait. And I was like, oops.
But then these two things doesn't fit together. The one thing says it provides a list, and the other one says you can query every property separately or whatever.
No, so one of them is, again, one of them is for sort of like the materialization of the selection properties and the connection properties, and the other one is for the active connection properties. These are two separate enumeration types.
So if you set a connection property, you can get back what you set.
Where you can get back whether what you, like how what you set was resolved. Right? That's the important part of this new thing, which you don't get out of the querying the active connection properties for the connection, because that just gives you the state, not the resolution of the state. Are we gonna make any progress on this issue by continuing to talk about it?
Doesn't sound like it.
I think we're about 15 minutes after merge, and we haven't.
I would suspect that it makes sense now to just have another path of at least two people of us looking for consistency and looking whether it now makes sense, and put the discussion to the next interim, because otherwise we just doing circles on that.
Okay, so where are we in the agenda? We were going to do something other than an issue scrub, right? How much time do we need?
Yeah, but we have what, another 40 minutes, Aaron?
40 minutes, yeah.
Right. We were gonna. I said we'd stop at the bottom of the hour at past, and see where we were. Decide what to do next.
So are there
a couple more of these, right?
Do we want to do 441? Because there's a pull request for that one too, which I can go ahead and merge before we have the discussion. I'll wait for it. I will arm it, but not actually. 441. This is about like basically adding a. So this was a very, very long discussion. Down at the bottom of this one, there's a link to 541, which is basically just saying you want to give the TAPS system information about how you intend to use, like whether after initiation you're going to be the one to send or you're going to receive from it, right? Like, so that is information that can be used in selection as well, and it supports this is for cloning, right?
I would like to talk about this actually after I talk about my other little slide deck, because I want to talk about how we interact with connection groups.
Good. Well, we'll defer it then and pick another issue.
Cool. Let's go these top ones here. So can we close this one, Kyle?
This.
Okay.
I don't think we need to make a change here.
Got it. Okay. Registries for interface, instance, or type. Ooh.
Oh.
Here's this registry. There are registry of interface types.
Don't we refer to an existing registry of interface types somewhere, or did we just look at one and say that we
just found that one?
We deferred from doing that after we looked at the registry of interface types.
Oh, right. Yeah, I remember that now.
Okay. Yeah. Well, wait. We can't do what we say, because we say that vendors can use something that's not in the registry, but they can't use ones in the registry, and the registry is still open and changing. So you can't just say you've got to use something different to what's in the registry, and then the registry is changeable.
Problem is that the registry doesn't make the kind of differentiation we want to make in the TAPS interface, and that's useful for most implementations. But yeah, the interface, the registry still tracks the types of interfaces, so you can't, for example, distinguish between a Wi-Fi and a wired Ethernet card by the values of the registry, while you can discover a lot of interface types you will never have on an end host.
feel like this is always going to be implementation specific. Whatever system you're on will have a set of interfaces, and
I also think the registry is part of the Yang model.
Yeah. But that also is like it's something that is management discoverable about the implementation.
Yeah.
So I would close with no action. I mean, yes, I agree with Kyle that it's frustrating.
Than not having a registry for properties.
Okay.
So I don't have a strong opinion about it. I was mostly just raising it as something that we needed to make an explicit decision about.
Do we need text to say that there isn't a registry?
Well, so there's this text here in 5.2.10 that says the set of interface types is expected to change over time as new access technologies become available, which basically sort of screams, please make me a registry. So after that, I would add a sentence that says the interface types available on a given system are implementation dependent.
Okay.
Which would essentially say this is why we're not doing that. I can go ahead and make a PR for that.
Okay. Do you want to say something about why the existing registry is not good enough? So that people don't say, why don't you just use that? Just use that. I mean, I'm just wondering about review time.
That's a registry? I mean,
I'd answer that at the review time. Like,
okay.
That's the thing that should be in the email to the reviewer.
So do we need an interface to query the system? What kind of interfaces are available?
Yang model.
I mean, so that is something that we needed for our implementation. Like, there's a way to like query, like, what are all the different interfaces you have? But that's going to be different again for every implementation. Like,
we can add a sentence saying it's recommended to provide this interface, so the application know which interfaces are there.
But it may also be something that's known more like at compile time. Like, you may not need to query it. It may just be a fixed enum.
This may be something that we don't say much about at all, because maybe someone in the IETF has great ideas about how to do things in this space and create management documents for this. But it's not something we currently have anything to say about. So let's not prescribe something that says can't do this or shouldn't do this, because, I mean, it may happen in time. People provide something, but at the moment, it's all proprietary.
Okay. So the next, oh, sorry.
We need to, I mean, I do agree, but do we need to give any hints about how an implementation can figure out what kind of interface types there are?
Read the documentation of their TAPS implementation.
Yeah. I think the active discovery call is going to be more about what are the specific interface names that are available right now. The interface types hopefully are part of the thing you link against. You just read the documentation header.
So I'm half serious. Maybe there is an IANA considerations statement that says, please don't create an interface for this. We don't think it's a good idea.
We know this is not the registry you're looking for.
And we could at least say that in TAPS implementation should document what kind of interface names are available.
Yeah. Interface types, right?
Yeah, types.
Do we actually have any guidance for implementers about what they should document yet? Because like if we open that floodgate, that's going to be, I think that goes in the implementation draft. It's basically here are things that should be discoverable about your system. But I think if we spent a little time thinking about that, we could come up with a very long list that would be useful and incomplete, but it would still be useful if it's incomplete. So it's like, it's not like the API draft or not being able to solve the problem is a reason to not try.
So I think we say something about default values for properties that are documented somewhere.
So this would be another, so yeah. I mean, it's another one of those things that's kind of obvious. It's like if you don't tell people what magic string they're supposed to give you for interface types, they're going to be annoyed with you. But
it's something you discover not at implementation time, but when somebody tries to use your implementation.
yeah, fair enough.
We're at the bottom of the hour. Should we move on to let Tommy show his slides and talk about multicast?
Multicast.
Unless, are there any particular issues that we think we could get useful comments on today that won't take up more than 15 minutes?
Gori here. I'm just a little bit confused about what we're doing with the registry status. Have I just missed it?
The property registry?
Yeah, the property registry.
Not about that yet.
Well,
did you want to talk about that?
I would like to know what we want to do.
So, but didn't we discuss this at length at some point already?
Yes, we did discuss this at length and decided to defer the decision.
Was this discussion while I was this the interim I missed in February because I was on an airplane and my internet sucked?
It was much earlier.
Okay, then I've blocked it out of my mind.
Correct.
Well, we've all forgotten the discussion. Let's have it again.
Somebody just tell me because I really don't know.
So we had a lengthy discussion and decided whether then that we should revisit the whole discussion once we get near to publication of the documents, because we're not sure about that yet.
We have a reason to defer it other than we didn't want to make a decision.
Yes. Yeah. And because it's a lot of overhead creating all the documents for that, the lists for that, and so on.
Oh, I remember this. I was the microphone and I said, yeah, if you want to waste your time doing that, please do it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like having been on the ISG for 4 years, I'm just a little bit frustrated about how many registries get created every time for nothing, right?
It's not a matter of code points. It's really just an enumeration of things that people like. This is the type of thing that you'd want a living document for, not necessarily a registry.
But that's actually a good point. If there's no thing about like trying to coordinate things and trying to avoid conflicts, then a registry is actually less important.
So, my
sorry, put it the other way around. It's the registry. The properties we have right now in the document are as good as a registry.
I think they will be changing over years, and I think one thing that would make sense is having a registry of the namespaces we have for the properties. So everything that's not specified in the document yet, with something before the actual property name, and just have it for documentation required and have some central point where you can link to the actual namespaces. This would be a very nice thing, I guess.
Why is it documentation required and not first come, first served? It's just a list of strings. Just grab a string.
It's not just a list of string, but it's a list of string plus an URL where you find the whole the strings beyond this namespace.
Let me ask the different question, which is basically the same question I asked the microphone last time we said this. Who is going to be an expert whose job it is to tell the IANA people that the documentation at the other end of this link is sufficient?
Also, like, I mean, isn't a namespace usually you say, like, I have my own little tabs implementation for like IoT something, and I have my namespace, I'm IoT company X, and I have my own properties, right? And I only want to use it in my tabs implementation, and like the users of my tabs implementation, they need to know about it, but they can read my documentation because they have my code. Why does anybody else implementing another implementation need to know about it?
For vendor specific namespaces, I think that's sufficient. For protocol specific namespaces, like I'm now doing the protocol specific properties for SCTP, having some central point to point to where these are documented, I think is really crucial.
But I think that falls more into the work that we need to be doing on the implementation side, and where we're talking about splitting the implementation document into the general guidelines versus the per protocol implementation considerations. Like if you have a document for, oh, here's how maps, here's how SCTP maps, here's how these things map, having a nice list of there in there of all of the properties that are relevant to them.
And that document then essentially creates a new namespace by being an RFC. You don't really necessarily need a registry then. It's written down in the RFC.
Exactly. And I don't think the registry is really, like, a registry is either about trying to have code points allocated such that people don't stomp on each other. That's not relevant really here. Or it's also about trying to make sure that we are, compatible in our two notions of like what this namespace is. And again, every implementation, like unless we have implementations that start to actually take raw string, like just like pass this string and assume it will be defined because it's an IANA. I mean, that hasn't happened yet. And so it feels like we could always come back and do that if it was like really a requirement.
So that was actually another part of the whole deferment, right?
Yeah, I mean, the only worry I have is if two people come up with identically named protocols that are actually different and have a name collision, but that has bigger problems than just what the strings are in the registry, right, or in the API.
Then I think at the point where we define the namespaces and the namespace for the properties, I would like at least Kyle to review this point again and seeing whether you think it's sufficient, what's documented there, or whether we need more text there.
I'm happy to do that. I mean, really, like the only reason I brought this up was that it seems like, one of the high level goals for TAPS is to create a better interface than sockets for developers. And one of the things that is helpful to an interface is consistency across implementations, right? So I'm just concerned about a free for all where a property means one thing on one implementation and a totally different thing on another implementation, and that's not apparent to the developer. So if we could just avoid that situation, so it's really more about collisions, and because these things don't translate directly into code points, you don't end up with that kind of interop problem, but you might end up with somebody translating code from one implementation to another, and assuming that a property means one thing in the other implementation when it doesn't.
That's good.
I will say from our experience with IPFix, would actually tried to use both a registry and a first come first serve a way to get namespaces in that registry to try and avoid exactly this problem. It doesn't actually avoid the problem, right? Like, so even if you have a registry, you are still going to end up with implementations that are trying to have portable identifiers so that you can like reduce the amount of work you have to do when you move from one to the other, and they're going to get it wrong. So like the registry doesn't actually help you. It helps you a little bit, but it actually then gives you the false sense of security of having like two things that have the same string that should be the same thing, and they're like 80% the same thing, but then it goes into production and you have to debug stuff. Fair. There's no way around that, right?
So I just put the section relevant for in the chat.
Okay, Phil, is it how much does it help simply to have an appendix that just has all this stuff gathered as just a list of names that looks like it's just a list of names, and then in future we could all get together and have a reunion and make another RFC that converts us into a registry if we really need to?
I think there's no reason against doing that. The only thing for the namespaces is that we will never get this together, but I think the TAPS wiki would be as good as a registry, probably.
Yeah.
I go on to would be perfectly reasonable as a sort of solution for this problem.
Okay, let's move on.
Great. So move on from issues for now.
Yes.
Great. So I will stop sharing this. I will start sharing the slide deck. Can you see this?
Yes.
We only see one of them. Sorry.
Only see one of what?
Multicast. It's.
Yeah,
I thought it was a funny joke. Okay.
Yeah.
But we all see one, Brian.
I multicasted it.
I'm going to pretend I set you up for that, Aaron.
Which is actually fairly relevant for this. So on our end, our implementation, we've been trying to flesh out our multicast implementation, and we've also had we're thinking about things that are similar to multicast that are not necessarily IP multicast, but like group sessions that you would do for like sending information when you're on some type of group chat like this, which has a very similar flavor to multicast, but made us think about what's the right API shape. So I was just looking for like, what do we currently have as our status quo in the document? What we say about multicast in the API document is this. Essentially, you create your pre-connection with only the local endpoint specified. Generally, if you want to do source specific, you specify the remote endpoint. So I assume you just call like initiate with this pre-connection. It's never quite spelled out. And that calling initiate would cause you to join a multicast group if your local endpoint was multicast and would kind of do all the right things.
So as I recall, I wrote this text and that was my intention, yes.
Okay, that's good. So this, I mean, I think it works. So you have a connection with only a local endpoint. It kind of seems like, especially if you don't specify the remote endpoint, it's really a receive only thing. It's the sync that we had back in post sockets. And if I want to send a reply to someone, so like if I'm implementing, you know, like we use multicast for our MDNS daemon, right? So I'm implementing Bonjour for service discovery. Right now, they just have one UDP socket that they join the group, and then they get the stuff, and then on the same socket, they reply to the people. It's unclear.
They reply with a send to, right?
They reply with a send to. Yes. So in this case, it kind of feels like, I mean, maybe we could let them reply just on this sync connection, but the full model would be like you receive this message and then you like turn around and you create like this connection to that specific peer, because you have to select a different local endpoint because you're not sending from multicast address.
Right.
So really what's going on is that you have multiple connections here that you're using in conjunction an entangled set of things that are bound to the same port, but using different addresses, a group of connections. So back in PostSockets, we had responders, and responders, when we were thinking, so we were
exactly this basically.
Exactly.
This is a merger between a responder and a sync.
Yeah, right. And so when we were going to implement our multicast, we were like, oh, we should bring back the responder object because that'll be fun, because it can let you receive messages from many remote sources and reply to them. So that fits pretty well. Calling it a responder, we were like, it's a bit weird because you could also like just initiate your send tos there. Like it's not only for replying necessarily. And conceptually, if people are thinking about like, I want to have this thing that's joining a group that's either my local IP multicast group or some broader group and interact with the people in the group as a whole or one-to-one within that, maybe responder is not the right concept. So responders are useful for multicast. They're also good at just doing generic message multiplexing responses. Connection groups are also used for multiplexing messages. So essentially the proposal is here is, what if we make connection groups have the option to have them be concrete and allow them to essentially take on what responder did? So currently, connection group is an abstract thing that you can clone within to get multiple streams between two unicast endpoints. That's great. I think for that use case, it's fine. Sometimes, though, on a server particularly, I want a stronger notion of that group because I want to be able to have lightweight replies to my HTTP messages that come in from my different streams. And so you could view it as like if you had a concrete handle to your connection group, that would essentially allow you to extract individual connections or just do lightweight replies. Ooh. You still on my screen?
No. Yes.
Okay, sorry, my computer did something weird. You could essentially just have this explicit connection group, and you could also monitor the state of your overall like quick stream thing or your group state. Then similarly for like a multicast thing, if I could have an explicit connection group that was, this is representing my binding to this particular port, joining this multicast group, and all of the things I can reply to the people who contact me over multicast, then I have one object that's very useful for this. So that's where we ended up. What do people think? Why is it terrible?
Go back to the previous slide.
Yeah.
This is a better.
Yeah, so like when you said, so does the problem break down a little bit to you have actually something that you would see as a connection and you want to like receive messages on a different IP address and you send messages?
So the model,
like my straight up solution for that problem would be that an endpoint can have multiple IP addresses, which I think is something that might be useful anyway if you want to assign multiple IP addresses, IPv6 addresses, for example, to the same endpoint and like somehow variate using them for some kind of thing that you call a connection.
So as an example, I should have given this on the slides. The way that I would use this for multicast would be I would have like essentially like a pre-connection for a connection group. I would explicitly list multiple potentially local endpoints of like the groups I want to join and like the port I want to join on. And this is like a special local endpoint for a group. I create my group to that. It joins that for me. I'm able to now receive messages that are sent to me on this. I can either reply to them or I can say, oh, I got this message from you. I want to kind of upgrade this into a full long-lived connection that I can do more like flow control on and have a longer session with you, and it just picks the right local address for me out of the ones I can send to you back on.
Is the assumption that your uni applies? Or you're referring to the group?
So essentially either you can send to, like if you just send on the connection group, you send to the group, right. You just send to the multicast group, or you can say, I want to turn this peer into like a full-blown connection, just reply to that.
For me, this connection looks a lot like the proposal we had with the connection pool, because it's quite similar in a lot of ways how it's handled and used.
Yep. Right. And it's essentially saying like these two things are kind of.
Yeah, I'm a little bit concerned that we're actually overloading a term which should be separate. Because the whole point about a connection group for me was that you can actually use, for example, different streams on exactly the same connection, right? It's just like opaque to you if it's the same connection or not. So that's why it's a connection group. While here you actually have to have kind of different connection in some sense because you're actually talking to different entities.
Right.
Of the two cases are quite different, right? Because in the current connection groups, the connections are entangled in a different way from in this scenario, because here you share all the characteristics. If something changes on one connection, it also changes on the other connection.
Yes, so I think they're very different in how you set them up, but once I use them, like, so the semantics of how you bring this up is very different. But I can reply, like, essentially these are just different data channels that I can send to a peer to get different resources.
Like, I think the big difference is clearly between those pictures is that in one case you have actually one endpoint you're talking to. It might be different applications using the connection or whatever, but it's always one endpoint. In the other case, it's like it's a number of endpoints where you actually don't even know who you're talking to. And I think that's a very big difference that like one should not mix up and one should actually try to highlight separately.
We've also got a middle ground there, right? Like if I'm talking to what is effectively a multicast address, I now have many endpoints that I'm talking to that are not explicitly enumerated, but they might enumerate themselves by having stuff come into me.
Yeah, I mean, the model is different if you're replying to the group than if you're replying unicast to a particular that sent you a request via the group, surely.
So in this picture, do I have to pull out a connection before I can reply unicast to one person?
No, I mean, you could reply lightweight respond.
Reply and magic happens, basically.
But so
that might help.
The IP multicast, like the way that that's implemented is that, you know, today I just have to send one message and my router replays it for me. But if I'm doing like kind of a multicast over a wide area thing, maybe I do under the covers, my implementation has to essentially do its own fan out, which is effectively just alias for a group of connections that I'm sending the same thing on.
Can I make a suggestion here?
Yes.
So I think that this actually go back again. Don't show me the empty slide that says thoughts on it, because that just erased my thoughts. Thoughts, none. I think that what you have here is probably a thing that's like I'm going to use a bad term, and so what you want to do is you want to take a connection group and turn it into a responder, and what you're actually doing is creating a responder group. In the multicast case, it does exactly what you're saying here. Like there's the magical mapping of the message, and it figures out how to hand that message back, just like you'd use send to with the current in the current pattern with the UDP. It figures out how to send it back. In a unicast situation, this is still useful as a responder group on a server, because then it's like, here's the thing I'm listening to. I don't actually give a shit about the connections. You manage the underlying connections for me. And I just want, it's like, you gave me a thing, I forked a thread, the thread came back, and here's the thing from the thread. In your particular implementation, a responder group is probably a subclass of a connection group. But that is that's a very common way to implement it, but I don't think we want to take that implementation detail and put it in the interface. But I do think the problem that we have is real. I mean, obviously, you ran into it. I think the way to do it right now in the interface doc is clunky as hell, and will actually cause people to say, okay, well, I'm going to create, a bunch of connections that are heavier weight than I think they are to model this thing that would be very simple. That, like, if you're just implementing this on top of sockets, you have like all of this metadata that you don't need ever.
So I think
what it is, I think it's a separate thing, and I think that the separate thing is called a responder group.
I don't fight about the name right now, but I think currently you could implement whatever you needed by opening a separate connection that you're listening on, opening a separate connection that you're sending on, opening a separate unicast connection where needed, and so on. You can give all the management to the application, and the application can do the right thing. Yeah. So if we want to hide this from the application or provide support for the application to do this, I think we should actually make this very explicit and have a new object, and it's very clear that this object is used for multicast.
I would disagree with the for multicast. I would disagree with it's only for multicast thing, but I would also request.
No, that's fine. I mean, it might be a responder, and there might be more use cases for it, but it's a different thing. That's what I'm saying.
It's a responder, something else as a connection group, and I'm really in favor for it.
Maybe because we left this open for so long time, maybe we should ask the question first: do we want to have like this separate thing here? Do we want to keep working on it, or do we want to leave it for later?
I'm not necessarily proposing that it needs to be in the API document now.
Why don't you write it as if it's going to go into the API document, and if we end up spending the next interim like half the time having very fundamental issues about it, we rip it back out?
Put it in a separate document for now.
It could essentially be an extension, because
okay,
implementation-wise, like it's really just a convenience on top of the things we already have. Like, and And honestly, like in the way
so,
they
but-
implemented it, it's just a bundle of connections underneath.
Even if we don't do this, we need to talk more about this in the implementation draft and tell people how they could do it.
Yep.
Okay.
So the API document is already really long, and I'm not sure if I would want to put even more concepts in there.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I like it, but I don't think it really belongs at the current time.
I'm happy with that.
Maybe I'm just confused, but what if the goal is to reply to a group, and why do we need this? Maybe I'm misunderstanding the problem.
If you only ever wanted to reply to the whole group, then you probably don't need it. But when we look at our multi-class applications like the MDNS daemon, it often is receiving multicast, sending multicast, and sending unicast replies to particular peers who sent it multicast.
Yeah, right. So for the case where you want to unicast reply to a message you got off a group, then I agree you need something like this.
And you don't care about long-term state with that peer. You're just like, you sent me a message, I'm going to send you a reply. I want it to come from the same port that you sent the multicast to. And so it's convenient to have those be entangled.
Yeah, sure. For the pure multicast case, I don't see this is needed at all. I think it's for the case where you're doing unicast replies to things you got off a group. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but even for the pure multicast, at the moment, you would realize it's like two different connections.
Yes.
One receiving on the multicast address and one sending to the multicast address.
Why is that not one connection?
In one case, the multicast address is the local host. In the other case, the multicast address is the remote host.
So the degenerate case is like two entangled connections, one that sends to multicast, one that receives from multicast. But in the technical sense of a connection with a remote and a local, those are not the same connection. They're inverted connections.
Is there any reason this needs to be a responder object instead of like a convenience function to create a connection from a message in the reverse direction?
Right.
Implementation.
Yeah.
But just implementation.
I'm not sure I understand why you need two connections to do a multicast group. Well, maybe this
I'm going to jump in here. We're at the end of our time, and this seems like a topic that would benefit from more discussion, probably motivated by some text. So I think that next thing is for Tommy to write something, and then we can talk about it in a little more detail. I think it's a sign of progress for the TAPS working group that we actually got to a place where we were able to talk about multicast at all.
Can I ask one more question? So, do we want
Yeah,
to
Ron,
have
I agree with you.
do we want to have a separate issue for a case where an endpoint can have multiple IP addresses? Is that something you want to cover? And should I open an issue for it?
Yes.
multiple addresses on the same interface. Or multiple interfaces.
A listener pre-connection already does that by underspecifying its local address.
You can also specify multiple local addresses. This also works pretty fine with the interface now.
Does it?
Is there an explicit place to do it?
You can add multiple addresses to an endpoint. There's nothing holding you back from doing that.
Yep.
And then I thought, my understanding was that it would overwrite the other one.
Me too.
So it's an issue. I open an issue.
Open an issue. Yeah.
Cut off this discussion. I've got I think 3 more hours of teleconferences, so I've got to move on to my next one. Can I just see? Well, I guess not everybody's doing video, but any objections to scheduling another 2-hour interim at this time, roughly a month from now? And I'll do a doodle to pick the exact date. You got a problem with that? Think it's unnecessary? I think it's necessary. I think we're making good progress. I'm really happy with the progress the group is making. These interims have worked out. I think they've been super effective. Okay, thank you, everybody. Please take a look at the Etherpad, jot down anything that you think you want to capture in terms of actions or topics, and that'll be the minutes for the meeting. And we'll see you in about a month. Hope you all stay well.
too.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Everyone.